So welcome to the Sporting Heritage Sport and Fashion Discussion webinar. How are we charting change in sporting fashion? For those of you who I've not met before, my name is Fran Stovold and I'm the Workforce Development Lead for Sporting Heritage, and I look after these discussion webinars, our study days, of which we had one on Friday at De Montfort University, and we'll be sharing some of the resources from that in the coming week as part of the Sport and Fashion Month, and also our network meetings, of which we have one coming up, which I shall tell you about towards the end. Little bit of housekeeping before we start. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. I will be sharing links to our speakers and their work as we go along, and by all means put questions into the chat, and I will pause periodically as we're going through the discussion webinar and pose them back out to our panellists. Having spoken to our panellists in advance, I know that we're going to have no trouble filling this hour with sporting fashion and sportswear conversation and discussion. I'm hoping that there's going to be lots of cross-fertilization of ideas and perspectives as we go through. So this webinar forms part of our Sport and Fashion Month, which is running throughout June. This is our opportunity as an organisation, and for all of you guys as members and participants within Sporting Heritage, to take a breath to look at this topic in more detail. So often we're so focused on getting our delivery done, the opportunity to take a step back and look at one particular aspect, as I say, in more detail, looking at it from different perspectives, taking in different voices, is quite rare. So this is our opportunity to do that throughout June, and there's a whole raft of activity going on, and I'll post the links to some of the other Sporting Heritage activity that's going on. But if you have sport and fashion activity going on that you would like us to link to, by all means do post it in the chat and I will share it out across everywhere. And you can follow us on all of our socials, and if you search using the hashtag sport and fashion, you'll be able to find out what else is happening across the month. So I think that's all my introductions done. I'm really thrilled to have our panel with us today with Max, Hannah, Emma and Henry. I'm not going to steal any of their thunder, but guys, can I ask you to just do a 2-minute introduction to yourselves before we get into the discussion? Max, can we start with you, please?
Sure. Well, hi everyone. I am a writer and publisher. I write about cycling, outdoors, mountains, that kind of thing. And since 2016, I've been publishing books with Isola Press, and that does books on similar topics and specializes in archives and that kind of thing.
Yes, I'm hoping that all these hidden archives that you've been sort of providing this platform through are going to be this rich source of sportswear fashion discussion for today's session. Hannah, can we come to you next?
Morning, everyone. I'm Hannah. I'm the Learning and Access Curator at the Traherne World Golf Museum in St Andrews, and I have a focus on sharing our fashion collections. I've got a lecture coming up here next week, and it is a passion for me as our fashion collections.
Lovely, thanks, Hannah. Emma, can we come to you?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Emma Traherne. I'm the Senior Curator at Wimbledon Lawn Tennis Museum. We're open all year round. We welcome around 100,000 visitors, and we have quite an extensive fashion and costume collection. And last year, our temporary exhibition was around fashion and sportswear, and it was entitled Express Yourself, Sports Street Style.
Yes, I think, yeah, we came and saw it as part of one of our Sporting Heritage events, didn't we? Yeah, it was fantastic to see that whole range of sporting fashion and that crossover, which between sports fashion and sort of more popular culture, which I'm sure we'll cover in today's session. And Henry, I really should have had you after Max, but would you like to be the other side of Max's coin, as it were?
Yeah, so I'm Henry Iddon, primarily a photographer and lens-based artist. I've also written for various publications, primarily cycling and outdoor magazines. And I was formerly the Arts and Culture Officer at Kendal Mountain Festival. I suppose I would kind of, from a mountaineering history point of view, I would sort of describe myself as an independent scholar, which may also be understood to be an outdoor clothing nerd.
Both are more than welcome in this session this morning. So now we've had a chance to meet each other. I'm going to throw open our first question. I'm going to keep it nice and broad and just see where it takes us. So Why is it important that we chart changes across sportswear and sporting fashion? Who would like to jump in first on that topic?
Can do if you like.
Go on.
I'll go in first. What I think neither Henry or I managed to say was that we wrote a book together called Mountain Style, British Outdoor Clothing 1953 to 2000, about the history of outdoor clothing through actual pieces of clothing, brochures, archive photography, that kind of thing. And so in a kind of mountaineering context, I'd say that, you know, the clothes that people wear and the development of technologies around that actually, you know, in mountaineering are really contributing to people's survival in life or death situations. And that, you know, clothing has played an incredibly large part in everything from, you know, the Everest triumph in 53, which is where the book starts, all the way through to keeping amateur mountaineers, walkers safe. That's one side of it from my point of view. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is charting how mountaineering clothing, which was made, a lot of it, you know, for the most extreme conditions in the world and the most extreme environments, has actually transitioned into becoming something that we all wear all the time. And, you know, down jackets 50 years ago were a very specialist item of clothing that if you saw someone in the pub in Sheffield or the Lake District or in, you know, up in the Highlands, you'd know that they were a climber. And now we all wear down jackets all the time just to go to the shops. So I think that, you know, from a kind of fashion perspective and a cultural and sociological perspective, that's another really interesting point of reference.
And and that advancement directly impacted the advancement of the sport. You know, you couldn't do the technical breakthroughs in world mountaineering, particularly through the 70s, couldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the development of the clothing and equipment, but the development of lightweight clothing that functioned in a relevant way had an impact on the performance level of the athletes.
And do you know what the driver was for that change in that sort of technological advance?
Well, it was partly through the need of the athletes. They drove that change, so that they wanted items of equipment to do X, so they would go to a manufacturer or make it themselves initially, or within a small community, particularly in the 60s and early 70s. You know, if Doug Scott wanted a down jacket lighter, he went to Pete Hutchinson and said, "Can you make this lighter?" Using better quality down, lighter fabrics, and so on. And Everest in 53, they developed the Wincol fabric in collaboration with the RAF. They tested it at Farnborough at the RAF wind tunnel to speeds of 100 miles an hour, windproof. So they were, you know, they wanted a product. How do we make it to make our objective feasible?
And that was really, I think, the kind of central question of the book was how these companies that are now household names like Berghaus and Mountain Equipment and Carrymore and RAV, how they started. And it was really just a very small group of mountaineers who couldn't find the things that they needed and that they thought would advance their, you know, pursuit, whether that's in Scotland or in the Himalaya. And so they started making themselves, and then, you know, it grew from there.
And Hannah and Emma, have you seen that sort of technological change in the sportswear across your sports as well?
Yeah, I mean, the one that kind of sprung to mind to start with me listening to you guys was sort of Lacoste basically kind of invented the polo shirt, and that was from him wanting to be more comfortable on court. The shirts that the gentlemen were wearing at that point, so we're talking kind of the 1920s, 1930s, were still quite restrictive. So by designing something with a larger armhole and sort of a non-starched collar and developing with others this the piqué cotton that we're very familiar with now, he was more comfortable on court. But I think it was 1928 when he first walked out with short sleeves, and this was very shocking that this top French player was wearing short sleeves. But it's interesting that there are a couple of these names in tennis that obviously some people think of a tennis player first, but many people think of the brands first. So we have Lacoste and we have Fred Perry and we have Stan Smith. And, you know, Stan Smith published a book in 2018 entitled "Some People Think I'm a Shoe," because that's, you know, a lot of people, maybe younger people in particular, don't know that there was a great tennis player, Wimbledon champion called Stan Smith, but they're very familiar with the trainers.
Or that those trainers were at a certain point the height of technological advancement and not a casual thing.
Yeah. Similarly in golf, whilst it's not life-threatening, clothing is adapted to kind of reflect the status of people in society. But I feel in a lot of ways that golf clothing has pushed fashion. Whilst you think that golf is conservative and has this perception of you know, being exclusive, a lot of the time it was the golfers who were pushing such things like knitwear. You know, in the 1920s and 30s, like the tennis players, there was a need after the First World War to have more loosened clothing to enable golfers on the course to try new styles of golf, to have more freedom of movement. And, you know, it does reflect the change in society generally, but the Scottish knitwear designers from Fair Isle creating fashionable jumpers, but also it being pushed through golfers. So, you know, the men and women using that as a new style of sportswear. And we think of that look of +4s and Argyle socks as almost being a joke of a golfer, but it was hugely fashionable at the time, and allowed for more people to play because it seemed more attractive. It was more fashionable for outsiders as well.
And just picking up on what you were saying there, Hannah, about sort of the social change, we talked a little bit about that scientific and sort of technological advance. Can you see the impact of sort of social change across your sports? You know, obviously, Hannah, you've just talked about golf, but across cycling, mountaineering, tennis, can you see how that sort of weaves in alongside? Have you got any examples that you could highlight for us?
I mean, it was really interesting. You're both, Emma and Hannah, talking about movement and flexibility. And if you go back 100 years to the 1920s and you're looking at kind of classic mountaineering, Mallory, that kind of thing, they would wear something that was very much like a Norfolk jacket, like a shooting jacket, which had like arm pivots so that you could climb properly and move your arms around in the same way that you'd need to lift your arms to if you're shooting. But that sort of also reflected that climbing at that point was very much a kind of gentlemanly upper class pursuit. And then in the post-war period, with people like Joe Brown and Don Willans, who are much more English northern working class, you do see changes in what people wear. They wore the anorak was a very popular style, which is a kind of smock style garment, but also we have some amazing pictures from the Craig Dhu climbing club, which is up in is it Dundee, Henry, or Glasgow? I forget.
Yeah, Glasgow, yeah.
Glasgow, yeah, and actually a lot of them were dock workers, and they'd wear their work overalls out climbing. So there was really a change in participation, but also in what people wore, and as much as the kind of gabardine sort of tweed, and they're not tweeds, but you know, you'd look at it and you'd think, oh, that might be a tweed jacket. As much as that style was very well adapted for its time, everything moved on.
Well, also in Mallory's day in the 20s, Mike Parsons, who was the founder of Carrymore, and Mary Breckle Rose, who was a industrial researcher at Lancaster University, they replicated exactly the clothing that Mallory wore from samples taken on the body that was found. And the expedition pictures show them, the guys at base camp all wearing sort of tweed jackets and looking quite formal. But when they're actually on the hill in the 20s, you know, they were wearing merino wool, silk, and these sort of fabrics, which now have come very much back in vogue, partly for environmental reasons. But there were a lot of layers, you know, half a dozen layers, so to say. And when that replica clothing, exact replica was tested on Everest by a BBC producer called Graham Hoyland and Mountaineer. He said that actually when you wore it all, you got quite a lot of movement because a lot of thin layers slid against each other and allowed a lot of movement. Whereas now a mountaineer on Everest might wear a big down suit. And in some way, the kind of Michelin man style down suit can actually be quite kind of, or not cumbersome, but, the movement afforded by the sliding of the many thin fabrics. He was surprised how mobile it made him feel, and warm. As long as if he stood still, it'd be cold, but if he was warm. And I was just going to add the other sort of change in climbing in the early 80s, when climbing, rock climbing specifically, became very more athletic in the movements and the technical requirements of, leg positions high and spread eagled and different, very much more athletic, very more gymnastic. That was the same time as kind of aerobics and those sort of sports. So climbers started to wear kind of zany aerobics tights. A is a fashion thing because they were zany colours, but also they were very practical because they were stretchy, cling on the body. Whereas if you climbed in the early 70s wearing a pair of bell-bottom flares, you couldn't see your feet.
Were aerobics leggings warm enough to climb in, or I assume they weren't using them to climb in cold locations?
No, just in the summer, just on like summer kind of hard rock routes in France, in the UK, on Stanage, the small, super technical rock climbing specific kind of summer elements of the sport. Yeah, the whole zany aerobic tie was a kind of very fashionable thing.
So yeah, that's fashion. It's also sports bleeding into each other, isn't it? And sort of outdoor, that need for movement. But it sounds like from what you're saying, going to those sort of snowsuit ones, that some area of the performance has been compromised slightly by trying to be warmer or trying to use new fabrics that you're losing some of that movement that they had in the old sort of Norfolk style jackets, or the thin layers that you were talking about. Do you think that there is compromise in that progress?
It's undoubtedly warmer, but go on, Henry. What are you gonna?
As I say, yeah, I mean, there's always compromise. I think there's always an element of compromise. But the other thing was interesting was that within sports that Ron Hill, the great marathon runner, he was actually a fabric technologist, and his PhD was to do with nylons and synthetics, and he was a big fan of nylon. He thought nylons and synthetics were going to be a great thing for the runner, which is why he developed the Ron Hill sports brand and the famous Traxxter leggings, which became, a very, very popular in rock climbing. They were sort of similar to the zany aerobics leggings, but not quite as gaudy. But again, that was another crossover, and he was an elite athlete. He also had a doctorate in, fabric technologies.
So yes, well positioned. I mean, that sounds like, obviously he set up his own brand, but I know in some of the conversations I've had with people, and when you sort of sports people have identified that need, or they can see a new fabric coming together, you get that small window of DIY culture before it gets picked up by the big brands. And I don't know if you've Hannah and Emma, if you've got sort of DIY items in your collections where people have made things for playing your sport, or Max and Henry, you've got examples that you've seen where there's been a need and it's been filled by something that then gets picked up by a brand further on.
It's not necessarily DIY in our collection, but there's an argument that Fred Perry invented the sweatband. But there was actually another chap who came to him with kind of the idea and had done a DIY, and Fred was like, this is not good enough. So Fred and him worked on it together, and then that was kind of Fred's first kind of step into thinking about launching his own kind of fashion label, basically. And then so him coming up with his own polo shirt, like similar to Lacoste, but we're talking about kind of later date in the 50s. But then I think interestingly, this kind of take on tennis or certain sports being very elitist. Fred came from more of a working class background, and perhaps it was that background that meant that he could see the kind of the marketing opportunities in creating his own sportswear and sports brand. So he would give away all his clothing, and this was before it's very common now for top players to be given clothing to wear, but there was no money exchanging hands. Billie Jean King, first time she came to Wimbledon, he just gave her whatever it was, 3 skirts and 4 shirts, but obviously they're all featuring his laurel wreath emblem on the shirt, and everyone's going, oh, she's wearing Fred Perry, and he would just give away, and then that was how he kind of launched the business, basically.
I think going back to sort of showing the societal change, I think within our women's costume and the Women Golfers Museum collection that we have as part of our displays, you see that kind of spirit of almost DIY. Before women had proper garments to wear, before they had proper shoes, golf shoes to wear, women would stud the soles of their boots with nails to give them greater grip on the golf course. And we have a pair of boots from Mabel Stringer, which is part of a sort of iconic outfit within the collection. And she would have done that herself before there was accessibility in terms of footwear for women on the course. And then later on in the 1930s, we have women wanting to see change in terms of their clothing choices, and Gloria Monoprio is our other iconic female golfer in terms of fashion, wearing a pair of trousers in 1933 at the English Ladies Championship, which, although there was women wearing trousers on and off the course at that point, nothing quite like what Gloria was wearing, and it caused this big debate amongst golfers and amongst larger society about whether this was an appropriate thing for a woman. But she did it, in my mind, to cause that discussion and in order for there to be change within the women's game. And you start to see other women taking on wearing trousers, the wearing of trousers, and now we couldn't imagine not having that choice. But it was, you know, a departure in the etiquette of the game, as the LGU, the Ladies Golf Union, said at the time. But yeah, I think that's, from our perspective, that's what I see in the collections that we have from the women side, is that kind of spirit of determination.
And wanting to be included in that right for sort of equality, to be part of the game, even if there isn't sports kit or sportswear that meets their needs. I mean, looking at, you know, we heard about it from Emmy Sale and Shane Smith at the study day on Friday about the rising hemlines on skirts that hockey players played in, and I assume that's the same probably across all of the sports that we've got here today. I wondered how you can sort of follow that story of those rising hemlines through your collections. It always makes me think of tennis first, actually, having, you know, I think there's quite a lot of similarity between the tennis and the hockey, but you must have those sort of things within your collection. Is that right, Emma?
Yes, definitely. And I was just thinking what Hannah was just saying just then, and about the DIY aspect. And actually, you could almost class the women wearing white in tennis as that step towards something that they wanted. So men kind of had been wearing white for things like cricket and croquet. That was kind of their sort of sports attire, basically. We're talking about the kind of 1880s. But when tennis came along, women were still wearing their day dresses, with just literally just what they would wear every day, very, very restrictive, but kind of coloured fabrics and things like silks and things like that. But obviously it's not appropriate for women to show that they're sweating. So therefore a move to white would hide the perspiration more. So it actually didn't come as a rule of tennis, you must wear white. It did come from the women themselves, that they wanted to feel kind of confident on the tennis court. And Walter Wingfield, who we class as one of the inventors of tennis, he really wanted men and women to play together. He invented tennis as sort of an equal sport, and people were writing to the press saying that women couldn't possibly play tennis, you know, their wrists are too weak, etc. But Wingfield kept writing back and saying, no, I've developed this so that women can play it as well. And so yeah, he was kind of great for that. But with the hemlines, yeah, obviously sort of things sort of got shorter and shorter, but you know, actually, there's often talk about sort of who wore shorts first at Wimbledon, but actually there's a lady in 1931, a Spanish lady called Alvarez, and she reached the Wimbledon finals 3 times. But in 1931, she played at Wimbledon in what was referred to as a divided skirt, or a robe pants, basically very big culottes. And so that was obviously very, very shocking at the time. So yeah, you can definitely see kind of the movement in the skirts getting shorter. And actually the 1919 Wimbledon final was quite important, because you had sort of 19-year-old Suzanne Longlong from France wearing kind of a sort of calf length and like short sleeve blouse, and then you had 40-year-old Lambert Chambers on the other side with a much longer skirt and the sort of full length shirt as well, just a more restrictive outfit as well. So it was particularly post World War One, it was this kind of like new generation coming through and kind of the retirement of that older generation. We've got a couple of photographs from the time, and you can kind of see that change happening in society and what women want and kind of are demanding. And Suzanne's outfits were extremely shocking to Wimbledon, of course, but she played so brilliantly and so beautifully. It was referred to as balletic, and she was just so good at tennis that it was allowed.
Well, yes, I mean, you would think that though you would automatically see, from the way you've described her performance, that she was at such a performance advantage from her clothing in comparison to her competitor, who may have felt that she was, doing things as they were right and proper, but yes, was it must have been made for quite an uneven match.
Yeah.
From a performance point of view. Yeah, we'd love to see some of those photos if you're able to share them during Sport and Fashion Month. Is there anywhere else within sort of the sports for those of you here with us today where you can see that change, the difference in sort of the genders of sportswear and how it changes? Is it reflected in sort of cycling or mountaineering?
I think in mountaineering, particularly alpine mountaineering, which was very much a upper class pursuit in the 1860s and 1870s, what you would consider the golden age. Because they were landed gentry, a lot of their clothing was bespoke anyway. So they would have a bespoke, Norfolk jacket made or shooting jacket and so on and so forth. Of whatever gender, they would have bespoke clothing. Now the women would often climb in dresses or skirts. Now some would take them off once they got out of the valley and then climb in bloomers. But some didn't. Some would just leave the skirt on all the way up. Lucy Walker, who made the first female ascent of the Matterhorn, she wore a skirt all the time. But I guess in that period, the mountaineering itself wasn't uber technical. There were sort of long, scrambly walks, so you could get away with she could get away with wearing a skirt. Whereas harder routes, it just wouldn't be practical. And also because it was a kind of a very classy thing, they would have, even in the Alps, men and women would have porters and so on with them. So Lucy Walker climbed with sponge cake and champagne to counteract altitude. Do you know what I mean? It was all very classy. So the type, if you can manage to carry sponge cake and champagne with you with your porter, then climbing in a skirt isn't going to be a huge problem because it's not like overtly technical. But later on, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people climbed in breeches, wore breeches, men and women. And again, even middle class climbers or working class climbers, you would order them from companies made to measure. Just like you get a made-to-measure suit, it wouldn't be overtly expensive to have a pair of made-to-measure breeches. And then certainly with cagoules later on, for example, when Peter Storm and Craghoppers developed the kind of the cag jag and so on, because it was nylon, PU coated, non-breathable garments, then they were incredibly baggy anyway. And ultimately shapeless because they needed to be baggy to circulate a bit of air so you weren't getting drowned in your own condensation. So there was a lot of kind of shapeless waterproof clothing around, but they did make different sizes. Craghoppers made men's, women's, children's and the teenagers range of sizes. And also back in those days, people would just climb in 50s and 60s, you would climb in woolly jumpers and woolen thermals. So woolly jumpers would have been available for men and women, and thermal vests, woolly thermals would be available for both men and women, from high street stores.
I do.
And was that transition, just thinking about, sorry Max, just jumping in really quickly, was that transition from the woman who started off with her long skirts and then transitioned to bloomers, and then later women who climbed in sort of more breeches, was that just taken as taken in their stride without trying to use a sporting pun, or was it considered shocking that they'd lost their long skirts and had moved into something more sort of considered traditionally masculine?
What I was going to say was, I think I really love that idea that you're discarding the kind of these clothing that is being forced upon you by you know, patriarchal expectations and by tradition as you go up, and once you're on the mountain out of Zermatt or wherever you start, you're in a kind of freer realm where you can be yourself. As for the change into breeches and things, I don't think that's the case. I think that you know, that was just it was a practicality thing, and but we do have some nice, really good pictures in the book of Scottish women climbers in the 30s and 40s, and they, you know, look to me relatively advanced in their clothing. You know, like Henry said, they're wearing woolly jumpers, often would be homemade. They're wearing wool shirts or cotton shirts, and the breeches that could be corduroy or moleskin, but you'd get them made bespoke. And I don't recall reading about that particularly being shocking. But what was, I think, interesting a bit later on as well is that, as Henry says, you know, there was a certain sort of latitude in the clothing in the 60s and 70s, but as the development went on from there, and as materials changed, and especially as the clothing was starting to get the boundaries were being pushed by these male mountaineers going, whether it's to the Himalaya or ice climbing in Scotland or that kind of thing, then stuff became more technical and more masculine, which is in part, I think, why these days there's not as much, you know, elite level female mountaineering wear, at least generally available, as there is men, because there was a point when it became, you know, it really became a collaboration between male mountaineers and manufacturers, and less so the female mountaineers.
And there was also an element of market to that, you know, because you know, they were businesses at the end of the day, so they're having to, you know, service their market. And if the market was 90% male, you know, then that's where the resource and inventory of stock would be focused, you know, rightly or wrongly. But, you know, but obviously the number of female mountaineers at the very sharp edge, very cutting edge, they were there, undoubtedly. Alison Hargreaves, Julie Tullis, and so on, the Poles and Eastern Europeans, and so on. But it was, you know, it was quite small, and even within men's mountaineering, it was quite small. So if you know, bring that to a sort of domestic kind of high street scale, you know, very small market, you know, then, you know.
I wonder if I think that's quite interesting what you were saying, Max, about once you're out into the mountains, you're losing the confines of those social expectations and social assumptions, so that transition from, you know, it was a practical transition from skirts to bloomers, whereas in the slightly more, you know, controlled, confined scopes of number one court or wherever you are, where, you know, during the championships or wherever, you're under the gaze of everybody, and, you know, the opportunity for comment and controversy and shock is much greater. So I wonder if it's just looking at it through two different lenses. We've had a question. So so Emmy, who I've mentioned already, who actually bought a split skirt from the hockey collection from the Hockey Museum at our study day on Friday, has a question, and it says, a question for Emma and Hannah. I've been looking at the introduction of divided skirts and bifurcated garments in hockey, 1935. I wondered what the history was for golf and tennis in terms of allowing wearing of shorts and trousers. Would you be able to respond to that?
I mean, I think I've already said about Gloria wearing trousers in the 1930s, and that's when we first sort of see women wearing actual trousers on the course in that period. But the divided skirts, there are images of women wearing well, those at an earlier period, and with the pins as well that would divide their skirts, the harem pin that would they could just pin it so that it would have, but it was all about control. That was the biggest thing on the links or wherever you're playing golf. The wind is an aspect, and that aspect for women particularly is preserving your modesty, and that was the whole thought behind these divided skirts, or weighting the skirts as well. There was another option for women, putting a wire weight around the hem to control the skirt. And then we also have a thing called a Miss Higgins hoop, which I've spoken about before, but it was a piece of elastic that would be worn around the knees to prevent the skirt from flying up. So when you're taking your shot, some women even would have risable skirts, so that if you're playing in bad conditions in the winter, the bottom of your skirt could become damaged, so you could shorten the length when you're out on the links. But then when you're coming back to the clubhouse, you would want a full length. So coming back to that point about having that freedom when you're actually out on the course to maybe have a slightly shorter skirt. I'm not sure exactly when the divided skirts, Emma, you might be able to speak on that from a tennis perspective, but I would probably assume after the First World War, that kind of period, that we would start to see those, and then that leads into the introduction of more defined culottes and then trousers.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably the right sort of time frame. Yeah, so I've already mentioned Alvara's, who had these very specifically designed culottes by Elsa Schiaparelli. So she was a very kind of outrageous designer, but also if you do look at some of her designs, they are very practical as well. She has this strange sort of double-sided coin of very strange things, but also very practical things. And so, yeah, she came up with the culottes that we saw in Alvara's in 1931. But very soon, the next year, Bunny Austin was the first male tennis player at Wimbledon wearing shorts. In 1934, we had like more traditional shorts on women, but definitely with comments alongside it. It clearly was a change in society to see this. Definitely discussions in the press about, is this appropriate, in the same way we had it earlier in the 30s, even with Lacoste, a man wearing short sleeves, you know, that just change in society. And I think it is interesting thinking about tennis compared to golf, compared to mountaineering, like that it, you know, particularly from us from a Grand Slam perspective, like they're very much under the spotlight. You know, these are big events, but were a very large events, you know, all in the press, and there is always an element of what are people wearing, and that comes through even to present day when we're looking at collecting from the championships, from this year's championships. You know, we're seeing, are there any technological innovations in what people are wearing? Is there anything particularly personal woven into what people are wearing? So that expression as well. But it's interesting, the shorts as well, with the French, the Roland Garros has just finished the French Open, and the French semi-finalist Boisson, she wore shorts through the whole thing, and there actually was a comment in the office like, oh, she's wearing shorts, because actually it's not so common for women to wear shorts now in tennis. They do, they're there and they can, but it tends to be more the skirt, short, or dress with the shorts underneath. So yeah, it is quite interesting to see where is it going to go in the future. Shorts and women, to know, you know, is that a trend that's going to continue? You know,
it's difficult to know, isn't it? And yeah, maybe only time will tell. But there's been the short skirts debate arisen again with the women's camogie team, where they wanted to have the choice to wear shorts rather than the skirts. It wasn't that long ago, I think it was back in 2021, that I think it was the Norwegian women's handball team, when they were playing at a European competition, they wanted to wear shorts rather than the traditional sort of bikini knickers for their game. So it's a sort of move towards shorts, but how long shorts will stay being possibly the element of clothing that women would like to wear, or whether it will move on to something else, either performance driven or from other influences.
I think it was around the 1890s that certainly in cycling, you know, there's an issue, obviously, you know, not easy to climb on a penny farthing or pedal a bike in a big long skirt. And so, you know, around the 1890s, you know, where kind of divided skirts started to come along for cyclists as well. And also, I've seen images of draw cords. So a draw cord could be pulled, it would sort of hoik the skirt up. So you would have your bloomers underneath and then lower it down. I mean, you know, there'll be experts in women's cycling where I don't doubt, but also cycling played a huge role in many ways in the emancipation of women, because it became hugely popular in the Victorian period, 1880s, 1890s, you know, and so on. You know, and women could get out on the bike and you know, without having to, you know, be on a horse and carriage, you know, driven by a gentleman you know, or taken out in a car driven by a gentleman or whatever. On a bike, they could go out and do their own thing, you know. So cycling played a kind of huge role within that, and there's undoubtedly a lot of you know, academic research and papers and articles written about women's cycling wear because of that split skirt idea, or baggy breeches.
The one particular researcher who writes a lot about this is a woman called Kat Young-Nicol. I think she's at London, one of the London universities, but she looks at that early period, and I think you're right, Henry, that there's a correlation at that point in time between talking about what women were wearing when they're riding bicycles and just a kind of general social disapproval of women riding bicycles at all. So it was all kind of intimately bound up in this idea, well, people pushing the boundaries and asserting their rights to go and, you know, participate in the same way as the men were.
But then interestingly, sorry, I know.
No, you carry on.
I was just going to say, we've got a fair few posters in the collection sort of advertising various things like holidays and things like that, where you see this combination of women and men, well-dressed people with bicycles and tennis rackets and golf clubs. So it's, although like maybe society is sort of going, oh, we're not sure about this, maybe advertisers and people trying to sell a product are going, but these people, we want these people to come and spend money and do things. So it's interesting from that perspective as well. Sorry, Henry.
Also, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's sort of slightly off topic, but cycling had a huge influence on photography. Sara Dominici at the University of Westminster has written an excellent paper about cyclo-photographers. And now, because, you know, photography became popular at the similar time that cycling grew, then camera manufacturers started to make smaller, lighter cameras to carry on a bike, or to make tripods smaller and lighter to carry on a bike, or make adaptations so that the bike itself could become part of the tripod. And obviously cycling along is slightly higher, you can see over hedges, you know, you get a different kind of view of the landscape on a bike than you would, you know, if you were walking or whatever. So, you know, cycling as a sport, you know, affected a lot of things, you know, clothing, photography, the way people moved around the landscape and so on.
So we touched on at various points during our discussion how your sports, without wanting to make a wide sweeping generalization, that they started with those who could afford to do it, that they have an eliteness to them in parts of your history. As the sports have been more accessible to those of lower social class, or that it's been more accessible to a wider range of people, how do you think that's affected the sportswear and the sports fashion for your individual sports?
I think in golf, it's you know, it is a topic that is quite layered, because if you're talking about club golfers, they have a certain standard of what is acceptable at different golf clubs compared to what pro golfers are wearing, and then there's also other forms of golf, people going along to play, do putting, crazy golf, go to top golf, and that has a different expectation today of what is acceptable. And I think that throughout, you know, we can chart the sort of rise of that loosening up of rules, for want of a better word, for golfers. I think more and more we see the need for greater choice for both genders, on and off the course and at all levels, and you see people wanting that more relaxed attitude at certain clubs whilst maintaining traditions. And you know, it's a hot topic within golf clubs about whether it's appropriate for jeans, for leggings, but people, generally speaking, from my knowledge of speaking to golfers here in St Andrews, they want to have their uniform on and they still want that golfy look, whilst there might be adaptations for taste, for style, for size, for accessibility, and cost as well. I think these people still want to feel like they're dressed for their golf match at whatever level that is. And I think that's what's so interesting for me, is how that's going to lead and how that's going to change in the future, and how we make golf more attractive by the clothing options that are available, is an interesting one to follow the story along.
So they want their sportswear to identify them as a golfer. So being part of that sport is part of their identity. But
Yeah.
maybe, yes, how you interpret that is, be really interesting to watch that change. Have other people found something similar?
I think during the particularly during the 70s, and early 80s, when outdoor grew hugely, partly it was a societal thing, people had more leisure time and so on. But through the 70s and 80s, particularly with synthetic fabrics kind of being cheap and cheerful, PU coated cagoules and so on, that also meant that lots and lots of manufacturers popped up. When we were researching the book and you went through 1970s outdoor magazines, there was the big players, your Peter Storms, Berghouses, Craghoppers and so on. But there were lots and lots of little, sort of mom and pop type manufacturers where there would be, a single individual who would pop up, make a brand and start making cagoules or gaiters or whatever. So there was a huge democratization, not only within the sport, but also within the kind of manufacturing base of products. And then later on, it crossed over into street and terrace culture. And also because there's kind of a hierarchy of clothing in some senses in mountaineering, you have a fell walking jacket, waterproof, or you can have a jacket designed for extreme mountaineering that's, £1,000 or £500. With that, you can portray yourself, notions of dress and identity. I'm wearing this £800, jacket designed for extreme mountaineering, in a bar in the Lake District. People may think I'm an extreme mountaineer because I'm wearing this type of jacket, as opposed to a sort of cheap and cheerful nylon cagoule. So the way people can portray themselves with different levels of clothing, I think is quite interesting. Which may not happen in other sports. I mean, other brands have different price brackets. The actual, your performance level might not be indicated so much by what you're wearing. I don't know.
I was just going to add that I think that we chose 1953 because obviously as a starting point for the book, because obviously that is a moment of high achievement, literally, but elite achievement, but it kickstarted a popular love of the outdoors in the UK. And there's other, you can look at that time as well. The early 50s was when the national parks were established, after a long campaign about the right of access and right to roam, the Kinder Scout mass trespass and other, mass trespasses. So there was a kind of popular move to be able to enjoy the outdoors, and Duke of Edinburgh Award was established around then. Outward Bound centres were teaching everyone, school kids and lots of people how to enjoy the outdoors. They were a big market for outdoor companies making cagoules and things there. So yeah, I think Henry's right. It's always been, the last 70, 80 years have been pretty egalitarian, but there are very different levels you can enjoy it on, and a lot of the clothing you see from the 60s through to today, I guess, is cheaper clothing designed for an amateur to go and enjoy a walk in the Peak District or the South Downs or something like that. So not necessarily like hugely elitist.
And I suppose the us having had lockdown, not really that long ago, that encouraged people to get outdoors when they could, and also that sort of enjoyment of the outdoors. And I think playing sport for well-being and mental health has encouraged people into sport from a yet another sort of direction, hasn't it? So yeah, maybe there's scope for different identities within one sport depending at what level you play it on. I love the idea that you can be identified as your level is depending on the brands that you're wearing, and maybe it's very subtle between whether you're wearing your £1,000 mountaineering jacket or something that's maybe less special that might have come from a high street sports store. But if if you're clocked across the pub in whichever jacket, people know which niche you've sort of crossed over into.
I think one quick interesting point as well. You mentioned lockdown there and post-COVID. That did lead to a huge growth in people visiting the outdoors, and particularly from the Black and brown community. There's always been this issue, about the outdoor sports being white, middle class, and so on. But post-COVID, there's been a huge increase, in Black and brown people of colour going into the outdoors. But one of the interesting things we came across during the book was that Sprayway in the 70s, a lot of the manufacturing of a lot of numerous brands was in the north of England and in the old kind of cotton heartlands of Lancashire and Yorkshire. And a lot of the people that worked in those industries were from the South Asian diaspora. So in Sprayway, for example, had a lot of South Asian heritage people, working as machinists and so on. And one of the items of clothing we photographed was a pair of overtrousers from the 70s, and it had the name of the manufacturer, the machinist in it. I think it was Azia Khan or Azam Khan. So they'd sewn their name on it. Well, I mean, now you kind of get this kind of provenance thing with boutique brands putting the name of the machinist in it. But I thought what was interesting was that in the 70s, although it was largely, white people, white working class, middle class people going out in the outdoors, the black and brown community, particularly from the South Asian diaspora, had a huge impact in that they were making the clothes for people to wear outside. So they might not have been outside like they are now, but they were making the clothes for people to wear outside. And I think that's quite an interesting area of research for someone to look at.
Yes, that sort of cultural accessibility to sport, I think, is a whole research area. Yeah,
and how that's going to change. I mean, people, some of the brands, started to make face coverings, for Muslim, faith hikers and so on, out of lightweight fabrics that, are more comfortable and so on.
Well, yes, as I was saying, we had for our study day on Friday, we had Dana Abdul Karim talk about her journey through sport and how she needed to, once she started being a hijabi, she needed head coverings and modest wear. And when she started, she was saying she was 15 in the year 2000. There just wasn't anything out there. So she was having to go and negotiate with national governing bodies of sport for her to play at England level to get things agreed that the adaptations to allow her actually to play. And one of the brands in one of the early discussions said, well, there is, we don't make it because there is no need for it. And she said, well, I'm playing at England level and I am the need. So, and then she eventually worked with the brand through England Rounders, and now it's been picked up by the bigger brands, and they've been consulting much more with a much wider diverse range of sort of global majority to keep improving the modest wear and the head coverings to make sure that they're appropriate for the individuals, but also have that performance and technical side to them, so that it is just part of what is available in your range of sportswear. In our final couple of minutes, I just wanted to talk about that sort of crossover between sort of sports and fashion. And I think, Emma, you picked up on it with your Stan Smith comment. How, when sports brands tick over into that sort of fashion side, how do you think we as sort of custodians of sporting heritage can ensure that sports connection, that sports heritage isn't lost, so that people know that Stan Smith is more than just a shoe? Obviously you see it, I live in Brighton, so every August we have the big mod weekend down here, so you cannot move for people wearing Fred Perry. But I bet if you stop some people, they wouldn't know that link. So how do we as custodians keep that link going when our brands and our identities cross over into popular culture? What do you think?
Yeah, I think obviously to working in a museum, I think the museum space can be a really good space to do that, and using the temporary exhibition was really nice to do that, because it means that we can have something really up to date and sort of current in there, but then it's kind of going away again. Our museum is coming up for 20 years old. I haven't actually managed to get to the Golf Museum, unfortunately. My team have gone up there, but I haven't got there. But I would love if we were redoing our permanent fashion gallery, which is very much just a chronological look at sort of fashion on court. I would want to weave in more of those stories, because one of the things that I just think doing the temporary exhibition was lovely, and we've always thought as a team, is that fashion and sportswear can be a way in for people who aren't interested in the sport. So someone might go, I'm not interested in tennis, we've never watched Wimbledon, but actually if you look at their trainers or look at the top they're wearing or their cap or whatever it is, like they probably own something which is connected to a sport and they don't know that, and it might be a way to get them interested in the sport or the history of the sport or how the sport connects with society. So I feel it's a really useful way in to people who are just like, oh, don't like tennis or don't like golf or whatever. Then I think it's a way of communicating with people who think they're not interested.
Hmm.
It's surprising how many people, I mean, you know, two brands in the outdoor world. Rab was founded by Rab Carrington, who was a, you know, big player in the 1970s in global mountaineering. You know, people don't have no clue that Rab, you know, was a guy who started off making down sleeping bags in his loft. And a lot of people think Berghaus is German, you know, not from the Northeast. So, yeah. But brands are starting to, I think, celebrate more of their heritage, for sure.
Yeah, I think when you saw the crossover in outdoor stuff from real, you know, mountaineering and hiking, etc., uses into streetwear, there was an element of subversion. It was going into subcultures like Henry said, to football terraces and to kind of rave, I guess, in the music scene, and especially in Manchester. And there was an element of practicality there, because these, you know, if you're outside a lot for a very long time, then a big jacket's a very good thing to have. But it was about subversion. But I think, like Henry says, it is now a kind of heritage that the brands themselves are bringing in to their identity, and are trying to work with it, because it's so significant, I guess.
Well, I think that's a lovely point on which to leave our session. We've covered an awful lot of ground, and thank you so much to Max, Hannah, Emma and Henry for being part of this session. With just 2 minutes to go, I wanted to flag up that we have our network meeting towards the end of this month on the 25th with Rebecca Bissonnet. We will have all our usual sporting heritage updates and member updates, but Rebecca will be looking at textile conservation, and if anybody has textiles in their collection that they're not quite sure what to do with, it's your opportunity to speak to a textile conservator for free and come and pick her brains. So I will put the link in the chat now, and I will share it with all the wrap-up information. So I will save all the comments that have gone into the chat, and with this edited recording will end up on our YouTube channel and on our website. Please have a look at all the other links that are being shared during Sport and Fashion Month, and do share your sport and fashion stories and your items with you. There's obviously a whole raft of things that have come up in today's discussion that we would love to see, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Fran.